In this class we're going to look at features of a business research report. We're going to start by looking at problem definition. Now you'll see from the headings we've got in this whole series of slides in this class that the headings tend to overlap with previous videos and other videos in the series. This is presenting a slightly different perspective, and when we talk about problem definition we'll be talking about essentially the same material as the other videos but slightly different angles of attack. We'll be looking at the problems from slightly different angles, so it's worth going across this video. It's quite a long video, as you can see. It's 93 slides, but it's worth going across it and going across the other videos in the series as well, and making notes and padding out your notes from the different resources that are made available. But in terms of the problem definition, well, a problem is simply any situation which requires further research. That's all a problem is. A problem is an issue that needs investigation. Decisions made subjectively, based on judgments and feelings, are not made on a firm platform. In other words, decisions which are just devised by the manager, let's say, in a business, and not based on any research, these are subjective. The manager may be very good at making these decisions, in which case we would say the manager is very entrepreneurial, or the manager may be forced into a situation of making those decisions. An example comes to mind here is that of investment appraisal. Let's say the business is considering investing in a piece of machinery that will have a lifespan of, let's say, 10 years. Now, there are many investment appraisal techniques to help us make this decision. There's internal rate of return and the net present value and so on. There are many approaches to helping to make this decision. But the problem is, what will the return on the machine be in 10 years' time? What will the world be like in 10 years from now? How can the manager know what the world will be like in 10 years' time? Is it possible to calculate the rate of return in 10 years from now? And the answer, of course, is no. So therefore, some decisions have to be made subjectively. The amount of effort needed to make good judgments may be limited by the available resources for the necessary research. Research requires it certainly requires time. It requires resources. It may require staff time, which takes staff away from existing requirements of the jobs, existing duties. It may require money, a budget. Perhaps that resource could be used more effectively elsewhere. So making good judgments may be limited by the available resources. The problem definition, well, analysis of the problem indicates the search that is necessary to find solutions. Generally speaking, identifying the problem, identifying it precisely, and writing down the nature of the problem may suggest possible courses of action which will help to resolve the issue. It's always important to attempt to identify and address the core of the problem. What's the essential nature of the problem? Because once that's discovered, then some remedial action, some process can be set up to address the problem, to address the issue. For example, let's say there was adverse customer feedback. Now, research into this may indicate that the customers were unhappy about several things, about the design of the product, about the value for money, about after sales service or whatever. Now identify what is the most pressing issue that the customers have come up with. What's the issue that most customers are upset about, and try and fix those first. Try and deal with the big issues and work the way through the various issues until all are resolved. But again, research will be required to find out what customers thought about the product and gaining that feedback, the feedback which will start the process of fixing the problems. Research has objectives. It just doesn't happen for its own sake. First of all, discuss the purpose of the project. What is the purpose of the research? And generally speaking, it's to help the decision-making process. If the manager or the entrepreneur has to make a decision without any research, then some parts of the decision may not be recognized. It may not have occurred to the decision maker that certain things would happen. When research is conducted, a fuller picture is presented to the decision maker. The decision maker has got a fuller picture and will take everything into account. The chances of missing some important part are reduced. The decision maker can see the whole problem, and it's much more reflective as well. The researchers have looked at the problem and have thought about the problem, and they may come up with suggestions to help the decision maker. So it reduces the risk or uncertainty associated with the decision-making process. There's less chance of missing something important. And also, it may throw up some new opportunities. The research may look critically at processes within the business at the moment and suggest new ways of conducting those processes. So new opportunities may be identified, new products may be identified, new markets may be identified. And the objectives may be grouped under general and specific headings. Now, the general objectives of the business cover the whole business. And the general objectives could be something like grow the business by 5% next year. That means grow the whole business by 5%. That's the general objective. The specific objectives could be to streamline the production process, reorganize the stores, get the marketing section to start to introduce the product in a different geographic location. These are specific objectives. Of course, the upshot of all the specific objectives is to lead to the achievement of the general objective, which was to grow the business by, let's say, 5% next year. So all of the specific objectives are contributing towards the solution of the general objective, to the achievement of the general objective. Now let's look at background material. Well, first of all, look at previous research. This is very important. Previous research incorporates all of the experience of the researchers from the past, the ones who have looked at similar issues in the past. It's important to learn from their experience. Their knowledge is incorporated in that research. The secondary sources of material they looked at, the methodology they employed, the pitfalls in the methodology, the issues that they've fallen across, the problems, how they solved the problems. problems they couldn't solve, the limitations of their work. All of this is valuable information which contributes to the current piece of research. So previous research is very important. Account for the circumstances that gave rise to the current research. Why is there a proposal to undertake a piece of research at the moment? What's wrong? What's the problem? Identify the problem and ensure that the research that's been proposed is commensurate with the problem. Make sure that it's not overdone. Too much research is being conducted to solve a small problem. So look at the problem carefully. Account for the conditions that caused the project to be authorized. What was in the management's decision-making process that authorized the research? Is the problem deemed to be that big? And will the research help the business long run? And in what ways will it help the business? Will it reduce costs or increase profitability or enable the business to survive? Or what is the purpose of the research? Look at secondary sources of information, as I said, and see what can be used, because they may cut down the amount of resources required. If information is already available, perhaps in the public domain, perhaps in libraries or from the Chamber of Commerce or whatever, if that information is available and may be used, it may give the insight that's required. And of course, the secondary sources of information may include valuable definitions and assumptions and indications of previous work and indications of good practice elsewhere in the sector. Now, the research methodology layout, well, the layout of the research. First of all, the overall research design. This should be agreed at the start, otherwise the researchers will be travelling in circles. They will not be very effective, there will be overlap and there will be a waste of resource. So a good design at the start is required. Perhaps a sampling technique is required, and the sampling technique may be stratified, random, quota sampling, snowball sampling, and there are various videos on different types of sampling offered in these classes. But what sort of sampling techniques are required, and what are the pitfalls in using that particular approach? What's the data collection issues? What problems may be encountered in collecting the data that's necessary to complete the research? Are there any problems? Depends on the nature of the research, of course. The data analysis, well, that may be very sophisticated. It may be statistical techniques, or it may involve computer algorithms and computer solutions, or it may be just simply a set of recommendations, a few statements making recommendations that the management of the business is able to read out, look at and consider. So the data analysis may be very straightforward, or it may be highly sophisticated. Again, it depends on the nature of the research. But it's important to mention the limitations and underlying assumptions of the research. It's important that the decision makers know that the research has got problems, that they don't take the findings of the research as datum, as fact, as unmitigated fact. It may be the case that the outcome is subject to variation and subject to a probability of it being wrong. And it's important that this is pointed out in the research. And what are the findings of the research in the context of the hypothesis? A hypothesis is a testable statement. The hypothesis is that the business should invest in this piece of machinery because it will expand the business by X% or whatever. That's the hypothesis. Now, does the data and does the research justify that hypothesis, or does the research contradict the hypothesis? What are the recommendations of the research? What's the research recommending? Buy the machine, don't buy the machine, expand the market, don't expand the market, diversify the business, whatever. What are the recommendations of the research? State the recommendations and state them succinctly. State them so that they're clear and they're short and easily understood. And set out the appendices. What sources of information were used that perhaps the reader would not be able to find easily? What newspaper articles, cuttings for example, from newspaper articles may be included in the appendix, or previous research, or some government reports, or sources of information or calculations. I'll talk about these later, but at the moment include the appendices. And then the bibliography. Show the sources of information that were used. List out all the sources of information. List them out alphabetically by surname, if the surname is known. If not, group them under logical headings so that the reader is easily able to find where the information came from. Now, all of these will be looked at in the remaining slides of this class. So we'll go back over each one of these and talk about them and pad them out somewhat. So we'll start with the sampling design. So look at the target population and look at the sampling methods that will be used. So it may be looking at customers, for example, for the business. That may be the relevant target population. And now, what sampling methods will be used to gain an insight into the motivations and opinions of the customers? Now, this will contain the necessary information, such as the type of sampling, probability or non-probability sampling. And again, there are several videos on these issues elsewhere in the module. But essentially, it's important that to decide if, for example, the population will be selected by random sampling. Now that would be probability sampling. Has each customer an equal chance of being selected and sampled, their opinions sought? Or is it non-probability? Does the marketing section simply phone up some people and that they know buy the product, and perhaps ask those people what they think about the product, and ask them to refer on to their friends and ask their friends what they think of the product? That's sometimes known as snowball sampling. That's non-probability sampling. And of course, there's bias involved here. The information that's picked up may be misleading. It may be wrong. The types of probability sampling, well, there's random sampling, stratified sampling, and then the non-probability, as I said, is quota sampling or snowball sampling and so on. So there are different types of sampling that may be used, and it's important that depending on the nature of the investigation, the nature of the research, an appropriate sampling method is used, if sampling is going to be used at all. And of course, this will involve also a consideration of the costs of the exercise and the bias and the effectiveness of the sampling. It's important to work out what size of sample is required and how the sample elements are selected. Random, non-random, probability or non-probability sampling. In other words, if it is probability, then what's the margin of acceptable error? If a sample of customers are selected, and let's say they were selected randomly, their opinions may not precisely match the opinions of all of the customers, of the whole population of customers that buy the product. They are just a sample after all. But it's possible to look at their opinions and the information gathered from the sample and say this is representative of the population plus or minus some margin of error. Let's say